So this is our final day, and what we have been doing throughout the days that preceded is trying to present a model that can give us maybe some context and some understanding of what has brought us to the present state of confusion in the world. And today I want to take a stab at talking about what may lie ahead. The confusion we've said is caused by this disorientation produced by a rapid phase transition in human civilization, which is taking place. Rapid in the scale of the human species over the last few centuries. A rapid phase transition taking place as humanity makes its collective leap from childhood to maturity. And we're in the midst of this turbulent adolescence, and so things are quite uncertain in many ways. We want to ask the question, well, what will the age of maturity look like? Yesterday we looked at stages in individual spiritual development from the state of relative self-centeredness to the state of relative other-centeredness. And today we want to look at the corresponding stages in our collective development. In terms of the picture of the circle of existence, we can paint a general picture that gets us in very broad terms to where we think things are going. Consciousness is the point of it all. And in the end, the consciousness reflecting upon itself, God knowing himself, God being loved, all these are ways of saying the same thing. Consciousness needs a physical substrate to become manifest. Higher states of consciousness need a more complex and interconnected physical substrate. On this planet, consciousness in living things correlates, at least roughly, with the size and complexity of the brain. This size and complexity hits an individual limit with the human race. We possess the most complex brains, not the largest, but the most complex brains on the planet. But even higher states of consciousness are unlocked when individual human beings, human brains, join themselves together, interlock, and work cooperatively towards larger goals. First in family units, then in tribes, city-states, nations, and empires. That is why we expect the next stage in human civilization to be fully global and deeply interconnected. Paralleling, therefore, the development in individual spirituality from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. But we don't know the exact form that this global civilization will take. But let's allow ourselves a little bit of rampant speculation, during which I will probably go way in over my head in subjects that I don't know that much about, politics and economics. But let's begin again with the present moment. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and the embrace of reason and the rejection of superstition that were their hallmarks brought an enormous amount of good to humanity. One could just spend the whole hour just talking about all the wonderful advances in technology and betterment of human life that came with it. It also came with, we can say, a dark side. And what the dark side of the Enlightenment was the death of these sustaining grand narratives, the sacred narratives that had sustained human life for millennia, and the rise of this anchorless present. One gets a sense that with the embrace of reason and the rejection of superstition, some baby has been tossed out with the bathwater. What exactly has been tossed out? This model of reality as a two-story building, that there's a higher and a lower, that there's a heaven and a hell, that there's this physical world and an invisible spiritual world beyond, which is a heritage of the axial age from a couple of millennia ago, and which gave fundamental direction to most human beings on the planet, has collapsed with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And it's actually collapsed in both directions. Both stories of this two-story building have collapsed. The top floor collapsed, the spiritual floor collapsed, because with the collapse of traditional theologies after the scientific revolution, people saw that their way of understanding their religions, their literal interpretation of their scriptures, did not accord with the scientific results that were now pouring in. Our scientific understanding of the cosmos and of the earth and its age and origin and so forth were contradicted by by certain readings of scripture. And what happens is the whole edifice of theology ends up getting negated by these great scientific advances. You have, as a result, the rise of atheism, the emptying of the churches, and the inability of modern people to believe the way that people believed in the past. It's as though, but still people retain the ethic that was based upon those ancient theologies. People still retain the Christian ethic, even if the metaphysics or theology behind it seems no longer tenable to most people. It's as though the edifice of Judeo-Christian ethics, and I'm talking here mainly about the West, but its repercussions are felt throughout the world. The edifice of Judeo-Christian ethics still hangs as though suspended in the air, the metaphysical foundations having long since been knocked out, and the rest of the edifice is now in this process of slow motion collapse, which has been accelerating very noticeably in recent years. So that's the top floor, which is collapsing. And at the same time, the bottom floor is collapsing. The bottom floor is this very solid material domain, the domain that at least in the early stages of the Enlightenment, it was promised that science would solve all our problems. We would figure out, all aspects of human life on the basis of science, figure out ethics and morality and everything else. But the bottom floor is also collapsed in the modern world with the death of the mechanistic worldview, of which one can think of Newtonian science as the hallmark of this mechanistic worldview that emerges from the Enlightenment, that is purely logical, that says that the world can be understood purely through reason alone. And the death of this mechanistic worldview shows us that neither reason and science nor faith alone are sufficient replacements for the ancient certainties. And so in the first half of the 20th century, you have this kind of denial of the mechanistic worldview, aided in some way by some advances in modern science, like quantum mechanics, which shows that uncertainty is baked into things at a very fundamental level. And you have these sorts of doubts about the solidity of reason and logic and the material world emerging in things like postmodernism, which would say there are no grand narratives, there is no ultimate truth, there are only power struggles. There are only different groups of people struggling against each other, and truth is whatever those in power say it is. And the postmodernist mindset would reject objectivity of any kind. Even the idea of progress becomes a casualty of the postmodernist program, which sees progress as a remnant of the edifice of religious thought. So what remains after this twofold collapse? Both the certainty of the existence of the spiritual world is destroyed, and it doesn't lead to a remaining certainty in science and materialism as being able to fully describe and explain things. So what remains after this twofold collapse is an anchorless present in which neither faith nor reason are sufficient foundations. We have a world today teeming with facts and information with no coherence and no meaning. It's like a tile mosaic with the cement removed so that the pieces are scattered everywhere, and they no longer give us a picture. There's a disintegration of the stabilizing influence of family values and the sanctity of the family unit. All of these are effects of this anchorless present. So what are some of the responses? Let's look briefly at some of the major responses to this uncertainty of the present, and this destruction of our ancient narratives. The first response is the response of many religious communities in both the East and the West, which is essentially to deny the values of the Enlightenment and to double down on the theologies of the medieval times and earlier. This response rejects the modern fundamentally. It sees Enlightenment values of the autonomy of the individual and of the primacy of reason as fundamentally godless. And it advocates a return to a more godly or spiritual time. There's a retreat to various forms of superstitious mysticism pervaded by various New Age movements. There's a retreat to religious conservatism, the teaching of scriptural literalism, and so-called creation science. And in its most extreme and virulent form, there is religious extremism and terrorism, and the attempt to take back the past by violent means. If one were to guess, well, what fraction of humanity still hasn't truly encountered the Enlightenment, I wonder if the answer would be, what the answer would be. If it would be maybe more than half, maybe substantially more than half of people still essentially live their lives in a world that is driven by superstitious ideas. The roots of the scientific and rational worldview, it seems, have not sunk that deeply, but perhaps not surprisingly, I think it was Alfred North Whitehead who said that the most revolutionary ideas take about 1,000 years to work their way down, from those who originally have them to work their way to the rank and file of people in the world. So that's one response, is retrenchment, denial of the modern, denial of Enlightenment values. A second response, and this is really for a minority of individuals in the West, maybe primarily angsty college students, existentialism. The idea that, well, there is no ultimate value, there is no ultimate truth to be had. The universe fundamentally has no truth or values, but the ones that we personally give them. Existence precedes essence is the sounding note of existentialism. One is thrust into the world first, and then one decides what it is to be human. And every person gets to make their own decision. In its extreme form, this leads to essentially nihilism and the cult of the individual. Here is we put philosophers like Nietzsche and the death of God and the cult of the Superman. A third response to this anchorless present on the political right in the United States, where an alliance has been made between the religious right, which I've mentioned previously, this just denial of Enlightenment values, and a more secular form of traditionalism or conservatism. This more secular form of conservatism responds to the anchorless present by finding its anchor in, for example, our evolutionary past, which gives us certain fixed archetypes, fixed ways of being that ultimately creates stability in society. One, for example, well-known philosopher and YouTube personality today refers to the lobster. He says, "Go back to the lobster," whose the serotonin system that governs its behavior is 1 billion years old and is shared with our own. And this essentially chemical system ultimately determines in fundamental ways how the lobster behaves and how we behave, and fundamentally determines and justifies the hierarchies that exist in society. So this is a way of deriving, or let's say rederiving, stability and rederiving certainty, really by appeal to our evolutionary past. But it does so in a way which can tend to overemphasize the fixity of our cultural forms and norms, and then correspondingly de-emphasize the issues of social justice and the issues that these hierarchies bring. And conversely, on the political left, the anchorless present leads to forms of identity politics, where on the one hand we have groups which are identified not by universal spiritual values, but identified by a common past, usually a common past that has suffered some form of oppression. And on the one hand, these groups which are identified through identity politics are addressing very real and urgent needs that need to be addressed. Social justice, the redress of historical wrongs of colonialism and racism. But on the other hand, the politics of identity offers no overarching idea of the oneness of the human race and our common destiny. Instead, it seems to promise only endless power struggles between the oppressors and the oppressed. And in the political center, the response to the anchorless present has taken another form. Really, since around 1989 or so, there has been a particular theory that has become almost universally accepted among those who occupy the halls of power. We can even perhaps trace this theory back to the publication of a single book, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, who in 1989, right around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, writes essentially that history has now ended because the West has won the Cold War and free markets and liberal democracy have won against the forces and the ideologies of communism. And his thesis was that this marks the end of history. The idea being that, following other thinkers like Marx and Hegel, that history does have a destination, and we've now reached that destination. And that destination is free markets and liberal democracy, the highest possible expression of human organization on the planet. But unfortunately, what that essentially tells us is that the purpose of human life on the planet is individuals competing to accumulate things and experiences. This idea of free market capitalism and liberal democracy being the ultimate in human self-organization has, I think now, a decade or two later, it can be seen to be a rather naive position, inadequate to the needs of the present day, particularly in light of the financial crisis of 2008. It's understood now, I think, or increasingly understood, that free market capitalism in its current form may not be the panacea that it was taken to be. But the problem is that this thesis still remains as the common sense default position in the halls of power in the West. And this prevents decision makers from imagining or implementing more radical structural changes that are required to political and economic systems. Structural changes that we as Baha'is know need to be made. And so this assumption and this common sense assumption about free market capitalism and liberal democracy being the best we can do is the source of, or one of the great sources of, our collective lack of imagination, our inability to believe in our own power to remake the world. In the face of a number of existential threats which are now gravely threatening humanity across the planet, the threat of climate change and our destruction of our environment, the threat of resource scarcity as the world continues to grow and consume resources at an exponential rate. There are approaching crises in the availability of energy, of water, of fresh water and of minerals that we face. And also the problems of global poverty and increasing division between the rich and the poor. These are massive problems that our current default solutions are unable to fix. Why are they unable to fix these problems? Because they rest upon two assumptions that keep us from imagining a very different kind of future. And the first assumption, and these two assumptions, we'll have two very different solutions to them. The first assumption to free market capitalism, what makes it work, is the idea of scarcity. The idea that there are a limited number of resources that we're competing for. And the second assumption behind our current political and economic systems is self-interest. The assumption that we can assume that individuals will always act according to their own self-interest. We can bank on it. It underlies how we set up and govern. It underlies how we do business with others, and in so many dimensions of human thought, self-interest is assumed. Both of these assumptions, I think, are proper to the childhood phase of the human race, but not to the stage of maturity. Why do I believe scarcity may be an assumption which may not hold into the future? And this is a claim, but I think a claim that we can all imagine being true, which is that the current scarcity that we experience, we may be on the verge of solving these problems of scarcity by emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, such as increasing automation. One technology that at this point few people are really looking at seriously, but I think will play a major role in the revolution of financial systems, is the decentralized internet, the blockchain revolution, which, depending on how it unfolds, could act towards redistributing wealth on a global scale. So these are technological solutions which are on the threshold of emerging, and which could, at least in part or even entirely, solve the problem of scarcity, which underlies as I mentioned, which underlies the whole assumptions of free markets and the capitalist system. Imagine if scarcity were eliminated, if through technology we had all the fresh water we needed, that we had all the minerals we needed, that we had all the, that we didn't have to worry about clean air and so forth. Then imagine what with that constraint lifted, how different kinds of configurations of human societies might become possible. But even by solving the problem of scarcity, the technological solution to this technological problem will not take us all the way from childhood to maturity. That remaining problem, the remaining constraint upon the future evolution of the human race and its transition to the next stage of our civilization is self-interest. And that's fundamentally a spiritual problem. Science does not know how to solve the problem of selfishness and self-interest. That's where the scientists cannot spark this next revolution, but the prophets can. And this is where the role of those great individuals that arise from age to age and inspire people on a mass scale to think about their lives and think about reality in different ways. And that's precisely the role and function of Baha'u'llah's revelation, is to expand human consciousness until it encompasses the entirety of the human race, until that circle of self-interest expands outward in successive circles until it reaches the limits of the planet itself. And when that happens, entirely different kinds of solutions will become possible. Entirely different kinds of economies, entirely different kinds of political systems, once you remove these constraints of resource scarcity and the constraint of having to assume that people will always act out of their self-interest. Just to give a couple of examples, what kind of economic system might arise in the absence of scarcity, in the absence of self-interest being the governing assumption. From capitalism, we would transition to an as yet to be named system driven by voluntary giving. When Abdu'l-Baha talks about the spiritual solution to the economic problem, in a number of places he tells us what it is. And what it is sounds kind of silly today, because all of our thinking today is based on this assumption that you have to take self-interest into account. But if there's a spiritual revolution, so that one reaches a tipping point where most of humanity can now be counted to think about others before themselves, not 100%, maybe 51%. There'll be some tipping point. There's always people in a spectrum of along the spectrum of spiritual awareness, from self-interestedness to other interestedness. So we're talking about reaching that tipping point where these possibilities become actualities. And one of these great possibilities that Abdu'l-Baha talks about in a number of his talks and tablets is this concept of voluntary giving. It's a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different way of thinking about how an economy might be run. He puts it this way in one of his tablets in Selections of Writings of Abdu'l-Baha. This is number 79. He says, to state the matter briefly, the teachings of Baha'u'llah advocate voluntary sharing, and this is a greater thing than the equalization of wealth. For equalization must be imposed from without, while sharing is a matter of free choice. Man reacheth perfection through good deeds, voluntarily performed, not through good deeds, the doing of which was forced upon him. And sharing is a personally chosen righteous act. That is, the rich should extend assistance to the poor. They should expend their substance for the poor, but out of their own free will, and not because the poor have gained this end by force. For the harvest of force is turmoil and the ruin of the social order. On the other hand, voluntary sharing, the freely chosen expending of one's substance, leadeth to society's comfort and peace. It lighteth up the world. It bestoweth honor upon humankind. But again, the solution couldn't be enacted today. It's a solution for this future stage when humanity is no longer entirely or predominantly governed by self-interest. Similarly, in the political realm, we can expect major upheaval and transition to, not necessarily through revolutionary means, perhaps through peaceful means. We don't know. We can't say at this point how that transition will take place. But we can also imagine a transition from the current partisan free-for-all of democratic systems, which have descended into oligarchies in all but name, to a form of spiritualized democracy where the divine will is revealed through a nonpartisan consultative process by individuals who are freely elected in non-competitive elections. One can write this out almost in very secular terms and see it as, here's a new way of thinking about and organizing and creating a governing system. One can also describe that same thing as the rule of God on earth, because it amounts to the same thing. The rule of God on earth, the will of God, is found and discovered through people acting through the process of consultation. Theocracy and democracy become blended together, and whether you call it the one or whether you call it the other, it's a matter of it's an application of the complementarity principle. It depends on how you choose to look and describe it. These will only be made possible by a spiritual revolution, a great tsunami of love that crashes on the shores of all nations, a revolution in the conception of religion, not as competing communities, but as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. So, thank you for listening up until now. I suppose we have time. We have some time left, don't we? We have a lot of time. That's all the remarks I had prepared. But so we either go back out and enjoy the sun, or talk a little about this. Yeah.
We have a lot of questions. The quotes from Abdu'l-Baha there, about not taking money from the rich,
Yeah.
voluntary and such. That's one of those lines that solves so many of the current problems, current thinking. Because the entire thinking now is how do we get the money from the rich?
Right. The whole thinking now is, how do we get the money from the rich? How do we impose
Steal it from them?
more taxes? But within the current boundaries and assumptions, which are largely true of our present system, which is people are mostly self-interested, that's how you have to do it. You have to tax by force, basically. And Abdu'l-Baha is proposing something which just seems ridiculously utopian on the face of it.
But then we have like Bill Gates who started the Khan Academy, free education to the world, and he put that together with the guy who was just teaching his nieces and nephews.
Yeah, you have wonderful examples like the founder of the Khan Academy and Bill Gates in combating malaria and the wealth.
Allowed them to get that rich is what's wrong.
Right. One can point to these bright and very bright, points of light of these people who have amassed, untold riches and then have turned around and wanted to do good with it. And of course, that's a wonderful thing. Is that the best way to build libraries? To have someone like a Carnegie arise and make his billions through monopolistic practices, and then turn around and build libraries. Are there better ways of getting those libraries built? Getting libraries built is a good thing either way. But it's a question of are there better ways of doing it? And what Abdu'l-Baha seems to be proposing is a kind of a world where if people wanted to accumulate riches, maybe that they would be okay doing that. Maybe there wouldn't be barriers doing that, is what I'm saying. But it's also a kind of world where people would be ashamed to be that wealthy when there's people next door who are that much poorer. And that's what requires the kind of spiritual revolution. Today, people don't think twice. On the streets of San Francisco, one of the richest, countries on the planet, walking past thousands of homeless people on the streets. I mean, that's where this division between rich and poor is perhaps just, at least locally, one of the worst and most visible. And people are okay with that. People don't feel a sense of moral responsibility towards those who have just fallen, and that's where a spiritual transformation has to take place.
Yeah, going back into the scientific aspect of it, I ran across a quotation by a guy named Gus Spaff, who had been in the environmental business for decades. And essentially he said 30 years ago, I thought that science would be able to deal with issues like climate change, environmental problems, and he named the third one, I don't remember what it was. And he said, but now I'm convinced the only solutions will be spiritual.
And we don't know how to do that.
We don't know how to do that. Yeah, we don't know how to do that. Scientists don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah. Yes.
I've been waiting to ask this for all the senior youth back here and for the rest of us too. Woven through all of your presentations are wonderful, of course, is the word consciousness.
Yes.
And this might give you a little chance to kind of reflect back on all 4 or 5 days, the meaning and significance of consciousness in your presentations here.
Yes. So what is consciousness? And I've carefully not defined it over the last 5 days.
It's a feature, not a bug.
It's tough to it's really hard to present an adequate definition of it, and I hoped that it would kind of become clear in the usage, but of course it hasn't. And one way of I think trying to answer the question is by asking another question, which is, what does a rock, a bat, a baby, and a human being, what do they all have in common? Because if we think of consciousness as a continuous thing which is possessed relatively by everything in the cosmos, whether we consider it to be animate and living and conscious in our normal sense of the word or not. But if we think of consciousness, and I'm using consciousness almost synonymously with spirit. Abdu'l-Baha also talks about spirit as existing throughout all the genera, all the kingdoms of existence, from the mineral through the human. And I use spirit and consciousness almost interchangeably, at least in my head. And one way I think about what it could mean is, asking this question: well, what does a rock and a bat and a baby and a human, what do they all have in common? And that is that they all exist in some relationship of mutuality with their environment. A rock exists in a relationship of mutuality with the earth. It's somehow aware. And one way of thinking or defining consciousness is simply awareness. Well, a rock is not aware, obviously, in the way that we're aware of things, but it's aware of the earth. And it's aware of the earth in its own rock-like way, because when you drop it, it falls to the ground. And so in that sense, in that most basic elementary sense, consciousness is fully described and reflected by the law of gravity. At some level, the law of gravity is actually, in that way, a spiritual law. You're describing love, you're describing attraction. That is also the lowest form of spirit. And maybe you can extrapolate from there sort of all the way up the ladder of existence to human consciousness and beyond, states of consciousness which human beings can't ever have, perhaps, because of the constraints of our physical evolution. Who knows what consciousness lies beyond ours? On our planet, we talk about the consciousness of the prophets, of the manifestations, as being on a higher level from ours, almost in the same way that our consciousness is different from the consciousness of animals. It's we exalt it to that much of a higher plane. To the extent actually that Abdu'l-Baha, when he talks about what is it that the prophet knows, what gives them their power, what is it, what is special about the prophet, and this is in some answer questions. It's on chapter 40 or 40, I think. He says. The prophet is aware of the interrelationships proceeding from the realities of things. The necessary connections proceeding from the realities of things, he says. That's what they understand. That's what makes them prophets. And he says, and from this understanding of the necessary relationships, they deduce the law of God, and they deliver the law of God. To them, it's a deduction. And of course, it's described in sacred scriptures as a revelation. The revelation of Gabriel to Muhammad and the burning bush and the dove and all of this imagery that gives a sense of the special consciousness of the manifestation being something which was almost literally top-down kind of phenomenon. But the way Abdu'l-Baha describes it in some answer questions is more in terms of interrelationships. Somehow they are born with a more heightened understanding of the necessary relationships that proceed from things. And Abdu'l-Baha says, that, by the way, is what religion is. When he defines religion in some answer questions, he says religion is nothing but the essential relationships that proceed from the realities of things. That's just a kind of a crazy redefinition of it. On the face of it, we think of religion as a book sent down, by God for humanity's guidance about every 1,000 years. Abdu'l-Baha says religion is the essential relationships proceeding from the realities of things. It's like the most top-down, possible definition and the most bottom-up possible definition. These are the two poles of the sphere in that letter Shoghi Effendi where he says, in between are thoughts and ideas that unite them, and they may seem contradictory on the face of it, but they're actually defining the same thing. And they're defining something that has to do with how things connect and interrelate. And I think that's deeply connected also to the idea of what consciousness really is. Higher degrees of consciousness are more deeply interfused, more deeply interconnected than lower states of consciousness. And that's why when we talk about higher degrees of consciousness, we also, at least I always associate them in my mind with a more expanded degree of awareness, so that, you know, a higher state of spiritual consciousness, I assume, is highly or exactly correlates with a higher circle of regard. You know, in the more limited human consciousness, one is concerned with one's own physical well-being. And then maybe at a higher level of consciousness, one starts to be concerned with one's family and friends, and then one's neighborhood, and then one's et cetera, until you reach the human race. And to have that true consciousness of the human race, so that you're really as concerned with people you've never met on the other side of the world, and you're concerned about their well-being in the same way that you're concerned about the well-being of people who live next door to you. That's kind of the uttermost limit of the expansion of consciousness, to my mind. And that implies an understanding and awareness of the interconnectedness that that defines human civilization. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but that's kind of where, kind of a non-answer. Yeah.
When you first started talking this week, you said maybe we're using the wrong language to teach, and that there would be.
Well, I wouldn't say that we're using the wrong language to teach, because we're certainly using the right language for some people.
Right.
What I wanted to suggest was that maybe there are multiple languages that we can be using. Not that one language is wrong and another language is right. And so what I've been doing over the last few days is trying to articulate another kind of language, another set of concepts, another kind of framework to think about a whole host of central ideas like God and the prophet and the soul and religion and the meaning of it all, that may use some of the same words, it may use different words, it may on the surface sound different or even at odds with the language that we're used to describing it in. And I've just wanted to suggest that just to show you, if any talks about the sphere with the two poles, that maybe we're talking about a multifaceted reality that has multiple poles, and maybe there are other languages that also could emerge and that would touch other kinds of people. And again, I'm the drunk guy, kind of wandering at the base of the light post, and my experience has been in the realm of science and physics and philosophy, and so I'm immersed in and have been associating with people who are more ruled by reason than love, I suppose. And so it's been, I guess, my personal mission to try to find a language that appeals to the reasonable side of things, without implying that it's better than or displaces other languages that may already exist.
So I hear you're on YouTube. Is that correct?
There are some things, that have been posted to YouTube.
Because I understood every word you said, but I didn't know if I could recapitulate it to anybody.
Yeah.
In order to use that new language.
Yeah, just type my name and see what comes up. There's a bunch of stuff there.
Okay.
Most of it hasn't been posted or curated by me, but there's a bunch of stuff there. Yeah.
Like two people over there.
Yes. Wait. Yes.
Can you expound on the possibility that Nuclear Law will be part of that vehicle of economic voluntary giving that will impact?
That's a prime example. I mean, that's a perfect example, actually. To voluntarily give, 19% of one's capital, to put it briefly, and that giving, that donation, actually not being acceptable unless it's given with joy and radiance, unless it's given not with a sense of obligation, but with a sense of spiritual freedom. That's key to the whole thing. And just imagining what would happen, if this became a thing, right? If people started, if this actually started happening around the world, what masses of capital can be accumulated this way for the use of and benefit of the entire human race.
I think language is a really important point. We lived in West Virginia for a few years, and simply living there and speaking the language that we brought with us did not reach anybody. Because as soon as we opened our mouths, we were outsiders. Perhaps if we had stayed there for 10 or 15 or 20 or more years and gotten to know individuals, it would have made a difference. The other part of language, though, it's not just the words, it's the whole business of the body language, the smile, the tone of your voice. All of these things make up the language which we project to other people. And I think it's really, really important, say, God is love.
Yeah.
Would you say a few more words about the blockchain technology? You just
Do you really want to go there? Don't get me started. I mean, this is a whole nother five hour conversation. How can I even put this in? Basically, right. So this is one of those things which is at a very early stage, equivalent to the early stage of the internet. And when the internet was in its very early stages, it was a true Wild West. And if you tried to find information about it, you would hear about pornography and drug use and all sorts of crazy stuff that people were using it for. And later, as the years went by and serious businesses started to get involved and the real potential of it started to become known, then it spread worldwide. And blockchain is now in that kind of Wild West stage. To try to define it, basically, it is up until now, what the internet has facilitated has been communication of ideas, which can be infinitely replicated. You copy music, you copy words, you send emails, you send text, you send images, videos, all of that. And all of that information which is being passed around is essentially not owned by anyone. There are attempts to capture and own information, but it runs against the whole grain of how the internet is constructed. The internet is constructed about sharing files and data and so forth, and you can try to preserve the rights, say, around a song and have people pay for it, but it's really easy to leak around that. It's really easy to subvert the and so whereas the internet is built around the sharing of information, the blockchain technology and the first generations of what are called digital currencies that are built around it, the first being Bitcoin and the second, and I think most significant, being Ethereum, are ways of using the internet to hold and transfer things of value, like that only you own. In other words, money. The first application of it is money, or something equivalent to money. We think of money as something that governments create and control, and they print off on printing presses and so forth. But you can create scarcity using blockchain technology, which is secured by complicated cryptographic processes. And which is spread around among thousands of computers around the world, so it can't be attacked, it can't be hacked, it can't be stolen. And you create a scarce set of assets, like in the case of Bitcoin, 21 million Bitcoins only ever will be created, and now those can be spread in fractional increments among anyone who cares to buy and sell them. And a market is created, and they become worth something. And a Bitcoin today is worth something like $11,000, a single Bitcoin. What is it? What's behind it? Just computer code. But what it represents is the possibility of owning an asset which you control, which banks, governments don't control and can't control, and which in an instant you can transfer to someone anywhere in the world for almost nothing. So picture a financial system which cannot be corrupted or which cannot be controlled or subverted by state actors, which love to do that. I mean, deflation of currency is as old as the invention of coins. And governments tend to deflate currencies to fix their own balance books and so forth. Here you have a currency which is unfixable, which is unmanipulatable, and which runs on the same wires and airwaves that the internet is run on. And that's such a powerful thing. It's powerful because it takes power, financial power, from the banks and financial institutions and from governments, and it gives it to whoever. It gives it to the people. It's an incredible democratizing force in a sense. One doesn't realize that whenever you open a bank account, you think this isn't costing me any money to open a bank account and to transact money and to use my credit card and so forth. But there are so many hidden fees. There's so many ways in which middlemen, take their cut as the money changes hands and as it's kept in this or that account. And all of those cuts end up, paying the salaries of a whole layer of the financial system, millions of people whose whole livelihoods are just moving money around in various ways. And it, of course, pays for all these billion-dollar skyscrapers in Manhattan and London and so forth. All of the capital that is required to create, it all comes ultimately from people, regular people who own money, and so and who transact with it. And so basically, this is a new kind of system that is that removes all of those elements of friction, that removes all of the middlemen, and allows people to have direct peer-to-peer financial relationships anywhere on the earth that is not that is borderless and that is not controllable. And that's just like the first interesting application of it. I mean, if you start talking about Ethereum, which is like Bitcoin 2.0, it's like it's Ethereum.
Okay.
It's like Bitcoin 2.0 in the sense that it takes this idea of digital money and it adds to it the ability to make it fully programmable. So you can add computer code to these digital assets, and this computer code allows you to recreate any kind of financial instrument you want, like stocks and derivatives, futures, and any kind of financial instrument, as well as ownership of any other kind of asset, like degrees. If you have a degree, if you own property of any kind, currently there's this massive industry of people just determining who owns the title to certain kinds of to real estate. These title companies, and it costs hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars just to change ownership from one person to another. So that kind of middleman layer that helps facilitate the transfer of value from between people, all of that can be subverted and made much and made computationally secure and instantaneous and middleman free using these enhanced blockchains that like Ethereum that have what's called smart contract capability. Anyway, you asked for it, so you got it, and this could go on really forever. But the reason I mentioned it in the context of this talk is that this is one of those technological innovations that has the promise of really subverting and disrupting the whole financial world, and the financial institutions are so responsible for the maintenance of this disparity between rich and poor. I mean, things are so constructed that it's just very easy for the rich to get richer in their current system. And now you have this completely alternative system that's now been created that people are only just becoming aware of. Now everyone in the room hopefully is at least aware of it. And this parallel sort of shadow system has the potential of massively redistributing wealth on a global scale. Now someone who's like a villager in Africa can set up their own business and be their own bank and transact with people in other countries without having to go through the impossible layers of bureaucracy that you have to today. So anyway, it's cool stuff.
But can they use this to enrich themselves greatly? Could that have the same effect?
Yes, it has the possibility as well. It's a sharp sword, and any sharp sword can be used. It's got two edges to it. So you also may have the arising of a whole new sort of set of rich people. Thank you.